Good afternoon, and welcome to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series. It's held here at the Museum of Nebraska History every third Thursday of the month, and a detailed schedule for this series is available on our website at www.nebraskahistory.org, and you will find there also a lot of other information about the Society's programs and activities. We would welcome those of you who are watching on television to come down and actually experience a brown bag lecture in person. So you will find the schedule available to you on our website. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation. They fund the filming of these brown bags for us, and that financial support allows us to broadcast these programs on public access television. So we're very grateful for that support, as I'm sure you all are who are watching at home on television. Today's speaker is John Carter, known to many of you. John is in our Research and Publications Division at the Historical Society. He is author of a number of several books and many articles about various Nebraska topics, and he is a well-known lecturer about Nebraska topics. Today, John will be talking about ethanol, a long hidden history. So join me in welcoming John Carter.
It's a delight to be back with all you culture lovers. This is a presentation that's part of a work in progress, and so there's a bunch of stuff that will be more than just modest speculation, but not where it should be yet. But I thought it'd be fun to bring some of the stuff that we're finding and to let you know a little bit about a history that goes back a lot farther than people think. It's not unfair to say that ethanol is Nebraska's 900-pound gorilla right now. No matter where it goes, it's going to be the thing that shapes easily the next decade in the history of our state, and surprisingly has been involved with the state of Nebraska in a large way and tied to the larger American history for quite a long time. And what I'd like to do today is to give you a sense of some of the arenas in which Nebraska has played in that larger story of ethanol. Oh, and one thing I'd like to mention, by the way, I've been assisted very ably with some volunteers, and Bonnie Quinn particularly has taken a huge mass of information and brought it into order and sharpened it intellectually. And without folks like Bonnie, without volunteers like Bonnie and Vince Goris and some of the other folks that have been contributing to this project, we wouldn't even be this far. So this program should probably be subtitled A Really Good Start. Okay, the start is with corn. This is a engraving done after a mid-16th century painting that shows what is purported to be a tribe of Florida Indians with the men working the fields and the women planting corn. My point here, of course, and by the way, I love the representation. Clearly this person had not spent much time in North America, because these people certainly have a Mediterranean aspect to them. I think they're the Neapolitan tribe or something like that. But at any rate, one important thing to remember about corn is that it is a product of North America and comes to us thanks to the various indigenous populations that tended to produce corn. Now, Nebraska turned out to be, at least in parts, a pretty good place to grow corn. And there was an interesting confluence. As we came into the 20th century, mechanization allowed us to produce corn in pretty large volumes. By the way, I put this photograph up because I love it. It's called Corn Girl, but I think truly she's the corn goddess, you know, the genius of corn for Nebraska. turn of the 20th century produced mechanization, which allowed us to produce a lot of corn. And so in the first decade of the 20th century, we saw corn in abundance. Okay, that's good news and that's bad news. And by the way, as we come up to state fair time, I'd like to point out that in this photograph you have Nebraska's very first corn dog. Good dog, good dog. Well, the farmers who grew corn discovered very quickly that they could produce quite a lot of it, as we see in these photographs. They're bragging here on a harvest of over 6,000 bushels on their small farm, all harvested by hand. And the good news was that there was a lot of corn. The bad news was there was a lot of corn. As we went into the second decade of the 20th century, that abundance started to drive corn prices down. And that led people to wonder if there wasn't just something more that could be done with corn besides this, the food products that we know. And so as we get into the 1920s, we see the birth of an industrial look at agriculture that I'll talk about in a minute. Now, it's been a while. This is a project that I've had going on for a couple years. But the way we got there was kind of odd. And it really, in the place we're at now, began with this, the Voyage of Discovery. It started with this issue of Nebraska History magazine, in which my colleague, Bob Puschendorf, did a wonderful article detailing a gas war in Omaha that took place in 1924. And on the cover here you see Governor Charles Wayland Bryan filling his gas tank at a municipal gas station. I guess he wasn't governor then, he was the mayor of Lincoln. Bryan got tired of the oil companies jacking up the prices of gasoline. And so, as Bob details in his article in Omaha, but also here in Lincoln, there was the threat and actually the actuality of creating a government-owned gas station that sold gasoline at a discounted price that Mr. Bryan thought was appropriate. A perfectly lovely socialist act. Okay, so in our magazine, on the last page, we have what we call PS, which is either parting shot or postscript, however you want to take it. And we decided that it would be appropriate to roll out a well-known photograph, a now well-known photograph, of Nebraska's earliest ethanol gas station. And so this is the parting shot for that issue of Nebraska History magazine, which I'm sure everybody subscribes to. So this is probably old news to you. What I was going to do with that story is tell a little tidbit that happened when we first found this photograph in the McDonald Studio collection back in like 1984. We'd sent it to our friends at the Ethanol Board, who passed it on to a then young scholar by the name of William Kovaric. Now Dr. Kovaric was working on a history of a book about ethanol called The Forbidden Fuel, which I believe is coming out in an updated edition now. And at the time, he'd sent us a letter telling us this interesting story about an alternative fuels conference that he went to, where he bumped into Harvard law professor Arthur Miller. And since we'd passed this on to the Ethanol Board and they'd passed it on to Dr. Kovaric, he showed it to Arthur Miller, who thought it was really wonderful. And so he gave him the photograph. And Arthur Miller then stuck it to the door of the session that he was chairing. And one of the panelists in that session was White House counsel, then White House counsel to the first President Bush, C. Boyden Gray. Well, it turns out C. Boyden Gray had some affection for alternative fuels. And so they hurried up and framed this photograph and presented it to him. And it hung in his office in the White House as long as he was in the Bush administration. Well, I thought that was a good story, but I thought before I told it, it would be polite to contact Dr. Kovarik and see if he minded if I told it, put it in print. Well, he wrote back, having no recollection of writing the letter whatsoever, and so I sent it off to him. But in the process, began looking at some of his more recent work that involves the battle between Standard Oil of New Jersey and the ethanol industry. And this again comes back to that technology that's coming along. In the 19-teens, automobiles are getting better and highways are getting better. And so we're building more muscular vehicles that they discover have a problem, and it's called pre-ignition or knock. And what happens is that if your gasoline ignites before it's at full compression, you don't get the horsepower out of the engine, and oftentimes you get that rather unpleasant rattling noise from your engine, and everybody thought that was pretty undesirable. So various people were looking at various ways to reduce knock, and one of the things that came along that proved to be very successful at reducing knock was ethanol. And so its initial use in the gasoline industry was to boost the horsepower that you could get out of a gallon of gasoline. At the same time, Standard Oil and their two partners, General Motors and DuPont Chemical, looked the situation over, and they made an incredible discovery. Standard Oil and DuPont Chemical and General Motors don't grow corn. And they were seriously disinclined to hand over a substantial share of their market, 10% of their market, to farmers out in corn country. This is a little bigger shot of that gas station, and we'll get back to it here in a minute. And so they got their chemists going, and they came up with an alternative material, tetraethyl lead, what we think of as the lead in leaded gasoline. And at the same time, this was kind of interesting to me, that Standard Oil of Nebraska is involved in this gas war that Bob Puschendorf was writing about, and that gas war was 1924. Standard Oil of New Jersey has had a little bit of a problem in that in their plant at Elizabethtown, New Jersey. They had like 7 of their employees go violently insane, and 6 of them died. And Dr. Kovarik does a lovely job of documenting this. Well, there was a government call to arms. Both the New York Times and Washington Post ran banner headlines that said we should not have tetraethyl lead in our gasoline, and chemists at Harvard and Yale went public with all of the dangers that were inherent in leaded gasoline. And so off it went to a government study that ended up headed by Andrew Mellon, the chief executive officer of Gulf Oil. And so they studied and they studied and they studied and they studied and they studied. What do you know? The problem went away. They just studied till it wasn't there anymore. So we see, at the time this photograph is taken in 1933, some rather daring souls trying to compete with the Ethanol Corporation, which was 50% owned by Standard Oil, 25% by DuPont, and 25% by General Motors. The gasohol people going against the Ethanol Corporation. It was very popular here in Nebraska, and in this photograph we have the sheriff of Merrick County, that central city where one of Nebraska's operating ethanol plants is today, and then Governor Bryan's, he was governor twice, automobile being filled with this 10% gasoline, this 10% alcohol gasoline combination. Governor Bryan was very excited about it, as were a number of politicians, because you remember I was talking about that little excess of corn, which was driving down prices. This had the potential for generating a demand for that market outside of the food market, something more than Post Toasties. And so Nebraska politicians in particular, as in Iowa, were pretty excited about this product. But we had that little pesky Standard Oil of Nebraska in competition with them. By 1922, I just saw a roadmap of Nebraska that located all of the towns in Nebraska that had Standard Oil outlets in them, and there's a lot of them. They literally, they set up kind of like the railroads did. You know, the railroads needed to stop about every 20 miles for water. Well, they paced themselves to about the distance that a Model T would get between gas stations. And so they were all over Nebraska, had a pretty good market share. Earl Coryell and the Coryell family, they were also in the business of selling gasolines and had gasoline stations all over the state of Nebraska. And so they're basically going toe-to-toe with Standard Oil here. They had a blending station at about 7th and Washington in Lincoln and got into the sale of alcohol. Well, it appears, and I only say it appears because I don't have the actual smoking gun. It's more than appearance. That Standard Oil got into a discounting program for gasoline that contained lead, so that it stayed 2 to 4 cents below the price of ethanol gasoline, what we now call ethanol, alcohol gasoline. This caught the attention of the United States Justice Department, who filed a Sherman antitrust suit in about 1936 that Earl Coryell was a party to. He was one of the complainants in that action, showing how Standard Oil and the Ethanol Corporation, it's basically a wholly owned subsidiary, were jockeying the availability of lead and the price of gasoline to keep their competition out entirely. They were not only interested in ethanol, but they were also interested in independent gasoline station operators. And so they set up practices that made it difficult for you to either get the raw gas if you weren't bought into the tetraethyl lead, or the tetraethyl lead if you weren't bought into Standard Oil. Well, this lawsuit went all the way to the Supreme Court and was finally settled in 1940, about a year too late to do any good for Coryell and his efforts. Evidence indicates that it darn near bankrupted Coryell, and finally settled in 1940 with the Ethanol Corporation basically losing, that they were forced into policies that weren't in violation with antitrust laws. But like I said, it was too late for Coryell's little operation. Now, Coryell wasn't the only one. Let me introduce a guy. And this is where we need to do a lot more investigation. Leo Christensen, Dr. Leo Christensen. He was born in Iowa, but very early his family moved to Kearney, Nebraska, where he grew up. Attended the University of Nebraska and what is now Iowa State University, then the Iowa College of Mechanics and Agriculture, I think that's right. Got a degree, got a PhD in chemical engineering, and became early on involved with what was called the chemergy movement. And that was using applied chemistry to take basically agricultural products. They dealt with some other stuff, but mostly agricultural products, and finding good industrial applications for them. Dr. Christensen set up a program at Iowa State, then moved to Idaho where he set up a program, and later ended up here at the University of Nebraska, developing an ethanol program, or a chemergy program. He was the guy that set up the Coryell gas station. We have some wonderful newspaper clippings that talk about Dr. Christensen and a couple of his colleagues from Iowa State coming to Lincoln to be feted at the Cornhusker Hotel and talk about what a bright future this holds. This is the announcement of Dr. Christensen's death in the Omaha Chamber of Commerce, and I'll talk more about his association with them later. There was another group that he was involved in, the National Agrol Corporation, which was out of, I believe, Wichita, Kansas. And they marketed a product called Agrol. And that product was drifted into Nebraska. I don't know how many stations there are. I can prove one, because it's right here. This is the opening day of the James Oil Company's Agrol station in Nebraska City. And in the April 1st, 1938, this is 1938 when this is opening up, just before the war. Oh, and this, by the way, is a detail out of that photograph. Let me go back so you can, that's right here. Nice country music band. Another little sidelight, if you look in the lower right, you'll see some of Nebraska City's African American citizens at the event. But here's part of the problem with Agrol. Once again, we've got the regular gasoline, and I'm suspecting that this is leaded because there's another pump there that's slightly cheaper, at $13.9, and Agrol, the 10% alcohol blend, is $17.9. Well, here's the ad that they ran. Now, I think part of their promotion was leaning on Nebraskans' patriotism, that if you use this 10% alcohol blend, what you're really doing is supporting Nebraska's economy. And yes, it costs you 2 cents more a gallon, but it's something where it's bread upon the water that'll come back in expanded products for our corn crops, which again are pretty large at this point. And here's the thing that I like about this. They're talking about their motor fuels as, first of all, they're being sponsored by the Chemical Foundation, the National Grange, the American Farm Bureaus Federation, and other agricultural organizations. So this is something where there's some national muscle behind the desire to see if we can make a motor fuel that uses agricultural products. And so one of the things they're arguing here is that this is not an experimental product any longer. We know this works, and so try it out and see for yourself. There's a bunch of problems with Agrol. It appears they had some management issues, some patent issues, and other things that basically put them in financial jeopardy. So that leads us to the next of our discoveries. The next one we found was, oh, and by the way, about a year ago we were able to bring Dr. Kovarik to Lincoln, thanks to our friends at the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska. And so we had a wonderful time looking at some of the materials that we have at the State Historical Society related to this issue. The way we found some of those materials was around the story of the Farm Crop Processing Corporation. Now, a year or so ago, I'd never heard of the Farm Crop Processing Corporation, as very few people had. And I got attached to it when my colleague, Don Cunningham, had an appointment with our then new director, Mike Smith. And when Don got to Mike's office, he discovered that Mike had somebody else in visiting with him, and so he politely sat down in the waiting room and grabbed a book off the shelf. And this is the book that he grabbed. The Nebraskan. I think that's a very humble title. And it's a book about George E. Johnson, the state engineer, the guy credited with, I'll be polite about this, keeping track of the construction of the Nebraska state capitol to the point that its architect, Bertram Goodhue, died. Mr. Johnson was an interesting character. He's the guy for whom Johnson Lake is named. He was credited with Nebraska's Little TVA, very big in rural electricity, an interesting guy. Now, the book is interesting because it's written by George Johnson II, his son. And George writes the book in first person. So he writes it as though he's his father telling this story, which is just plumb odd. But be that as it may, this book was sitting on the shelf and Don happened to grab it, and fate took a hand. And pretty quick, Don's down in my office saying, "Have you seen this?" Chapter 6, The Age of Chemistry, or Chemergy. And I allowed as to how I had not seen that. And so we looked at it and got to scratching our heads, and lo and behold, this is another one of Leo Christensen's projects and one of George Johnson's projects. And that's the creation of the Farm Crops Processing Corporation. Now, Farm Crops Processing got birthed just as we were going into World War II. Okay? We have a problem when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Well, we had several problems, but I'll deal with the one that is on our table today. And that's that Japan closed us off from all of our sources of latex. And because we lacked sources of latex, by 1942, as we're rolling into the war, we don't have enough rubber reserves to carry us more than 3/4 of the way through the first year of the war. And this is a problem because not only do we need the rubber for tires for military vehicles, we need rubber for the tires of domestic vehicles so that workers can get to and from defense plants, so that farmers can be out in the fields. All of these things. If we run out of rubber, we lose the war. And people were talking about this, as I'll show you in a little bit. So we're going into the war, and we have no rubber. Now, there's another little element at play here, which is that Standard Oil of New Jersey has gotten into what newspapers called a full marriage with the IG Farben Corporation. Now, IG Farben was a chemical corporation that was, several critics said, if you say IG Farben, what you're saying is Adolf Hitler. They were the guys that produced a lot of the technology that made the Blitzkrieg happen. Motor fuels that were highly effective. They developed synthetic rubber. There are some, and again, until I can prove it, I'm not going to say for sure, so I'll hedge it with some, but I'm kind of one of them, that thinks that the evidence shows that basically Standard Oil thought that Germany was going to win the war and they wanted to be on the right side for marketing in Europe. An interesting problem to have. Well, there were several technologies available to us to produce artificial rubber. The one that got the leap, of course, was DuPont Chemical and Standard Oil of New Jersey, who were working on a method to produce synthetic rubber out of petroleum. Okay? Dr. Christensen and George Johnson and their partners, and their partners are kind of interesting. Frank Robinson from Kearney, who later moved to Omaha, was a stock raiser out in Kearney and a pretty substantial man, was one of the founders of the corporation. Art Weaver, the former governor of the state, was one of the founders. Alvin Johnson, the president of the Livestock Bank in South Omaha, was one of the founders. And C.A. Sorensen, the former attorney general and the father of Ted Sorensen, JFK's advisor, was one of the founders and was their general counsel. And what they proposed was to develop in Nebraska a series of 5 ethanol plants tied to rubber production facilities. Now, here people ask me over and over and over again, how do you make rubber out of alcohol? And the answer is simple. Magic. I don't have a clue. I've seen the science, I've seen the formulas. I don't know how, but they do, and they can make a lot of rubber. So they send a proposal. They form this company with the idea of buying up various older electrical facilities that had boilers attached to them along Nebraska's rivers. And they're going to build 5 of these things, each with a production capacity of about 10,000 gallons of ethanol a day, from which they would then make rubber and then put rubber on railroad cars to go off and meet the needs of the war industry. Okay, here's some of the uses for rubber. Here's a woman in 1941 who is, as you see, manufacturing self-sealing gasoline tanks that they made out of rubber, and this is Goodyear that's doing it. By the way, the rubber industries work real hard to make sure that they maintain control of the production of synthetic rubber, so there's some other players at work. The Goodyear plant here in Lincoln made self-sealing tanks like this during the war. So here she is making it. And then here is the production of artificial rubber at the B.F. Goodrich plant in Akron in 1941. I had to put these pictures in just because they're beautiful. And these are things that you can see by going on the American Memory website. There's a page there called The Color Photographs, Great Depression through World War II. And they're all the color photographs that the Works Progress Administration acquired and the Office of War Information acquired. And they're like this. They're just beautiful. So at any rate, here we're rolling out artificial rubber, getting ready to manufacture various products that are necessary to the war effort. And by the way, there's other uses for that ethanol. Ethanol was used as a sweetener, basically, a power enhancer for aeronautics fuels. Both fighters and bombers had these alcohol jets that if they needed a burst of energy, they'd shoot a bunch of alcohol into it, and all of a sudden their horsepower would just pop up and they could take off. And I was watching a World War II movie, you know, one of those bad things on the World War II channel, some people call the History Channel, where inside you could see a little thing that said alcohol and the little gizmo that you pulled. So it's being used as a fuel. To show you how important artificial rubber was, upwards of 3/4 of the rolling stock that hit Omaha Beach were operating on synthetic rubber. And by the time we are invading Germany, a lot of the vehicles in the military are running on a 10% blend of ethanol and gasoline, just because motor fuel was at a premium. Now, the Germans have, of course, learned how to use 100% ethanol as a motor fuel or blends so that they were less dependent on oil fields that they didn't have. And they also learned early on about the manufacture of artificial rubber from alcohol. Now, again, one of the things that happened between our friends at Standard Oil and our friends at IG Farben is that Standard Oil gave IG Farben some patent information on some of the things that they were doing to create artificial rubber. And IG Farben in return said thank you. There were several articles that we've discovered, news articles, very critical of the fact that from about 1936 to 1940, United States technology got poured into Germany, and we got very little back other than Standard Oil having a big chunk of IG Farben. Okay, this is the farm crops processing facility in Omaha, and we've got some decent photos of it. This is, I think, 1943, about the time they're just getting up and running. And this was a very creative thing, which I'll get to in a minute. Let me just leave this on and talk a little bit about the problems they ran into. So they come up with this idea to build a ethanol plant for the production of artificial rubber. But they ran into a problem. The Roosevelt administration had hired, or hadn't hired, they brought in a whole bunch of what they call dollar-a-year men. These are all substantial captains of industry who came on simply to serve their country. They were paid a nominal salary of $1 a year. Very nice. A lot of them had direct ties to the oil industry, and a lot of them had direct ties to Standard Oil, including the people who were on the, let me see if I can find this here. There's a great, what I'm looking at here, by the way, and this is one of the fun finds. Fulton Lewis Jr. was a conservative radio broadcaster on the Mutual Broadcasting System, and he worked out of station WOL in Washington, D.C., did these regular news commentaries. Now, he's a very conservative man, so conservative that I don't believe he owned a left shoe. And he, in June of 1942, starts a series of 5 nightly broadcasts where he talks about some of the little difficulties that the United States is having in acquiring the synthetic rubber that it needs. And he goes on for 5 nights, and we've actually got transcripts of his broadcast. In there, he talks about the problem with the Rubber Reserves Corporation. This is a federal government corporation set up to manage all of the rubber assets that the United States government has in wartime. And then there's also the War Products Corporation. So off goes George Johnson to talk with the people, the various people that he needs to get his plant in operation. And to say that he gets stonewalled is an understatement. Now let's look at where things were when he started. The United States government ponied up $650 million to the oil industry to build plants to produce rubber out of oil. And this $650 million the United States was promised meant that we would have full rubber production within a year. Okay? Turns out that that wasn't quite accurate. And what Fulton Lewis Jr. discovers, and in his, I'm just going to really digest this. There's a lot more to it than what I'm going to talk about here. But what Fulton Lewis concludes after a lengthy investigative effort was that between the Rubber Reserve Board and the War Production Board, they created this wonderful little thing. By the way, both of them were chaired by people with very strong ties to the petroleum industry. And basically, they did not want ethanol used to produce rubber because guess what? Standard Oil doesn't grow corn. Okay, so he goes to the Rubber Reserves Board saying we need just some war reserved products to get ourselves going. And he did a very interesting thing, and we see that in several places. To set up his ethanol plant, first of all, the government insisted that he not set up 5 of them, but they wanted one that produced 50,000 gallons of ethanol a day, which is why they ended up in Omaha and not 5 sites across the state. They wanted to be a little closer to the source of production of the corn because one of their thoughts was that the expense of artificial rubber comes not in its manufacture but its transportation. And it was one of the reasons they were arguing against petroleum. You need to bring petroleum from wherever you're getting it out of the soil, and then you need to turn that into something that will then produce rubber, and then you need to take that rubber to some place where it can be used as product. And so they had 3 different transportation legs in their system, and what Johnson proposed was one, that you bring corn in, and he argued, by the way, that the government had all this lovely surplus corn that they'd been buying up during the Depression to support farmers to keep them from going out of business. He said, first of all, you got to pump oil out of the ground. We already have the grain sitting there, and the government already owns it. So there's no cost in the stuff of production because it's already purchased. It's surplus. Second, from the minute they have their plant operational, from the minute they get the okay to do their plant, to get it built and in full operation, he said was going to take between 6 months and 8 months, and that proved to be true. So, in the end, Johnson only needed about 150 tons of rebar total to be able to build this plant, because he went to Colorado mines and found a bunch of abandoned pumps, loaded them up and brought those back to Nebraska. Went around to Nebraska mills, abandoned mills, and found abandoned grinders. And so he had all of this stuff. I mean, it really was a Rube Goldberg operation. All of this stuff, all he needed in terms of steel was 150 tons of rebar, because rather than build his vats out of steel, he was going to build them out of concrete, but still needed that 150 tons of rebar to be able to pour the concrete. Well, the Rubber Reserve Board said, we will give you permission to get your steel once you prove that you can make rubber at the capacity that you say you can. And to do that, he needed War Products Corporation, or War Production Board's permission to get the steel to build the tanks. And they said, no, you have to get your alcohol license first. And then the alcohol people said, we'll give you that license the minute you've got a plant where you can show us that you're going to be producing. And so it was just this circle that, again, Fulton Lewis Jr., conservative news columnist, shared with the citizens of the United States in June of 1942. Some interesting people, and we really don't have time to get into it. In fact, I'm about out of time. Let me just show you some more pictures of the plant. This was a big operation. Again, it was the old Public Power Building, 4th and Jones in Omaha. Okay, why not Omaha? First, this is a photograph of one of the big players in this, George W. Norris. Everybody knows George Norris about the unicameral and public power and the TVA. He was a big player in ethanol, but you don't hear about it, and I think the reason you don't hear about it is ethanol lost. Here's, by the way, the Russians and the Poles had been producing rubber, lots of rubber, out of alcohol for a long, long time, and how their governments got the vodka out of the hands of the Russians, I will never know, but they did. And the Russians offered us the technology. They said, we'll show you how to do it. This is the Publicker plant in Philadelphia, a plant that was trying to get permission to go into production as well. And this is a Polish, they say, inventor, showing how you make rubber out of alcohol. Now, there, interestingly, the War Production Board and Rubber Reserve Board said, yeah, we'll sure get behind Publicker, but first you have to put on a 6-month demonstration project. Again, just sandbagging against alcohol. In the top photograph, in this newspaper clipping, we see George Norris at a Senate hearing where he literally makes rubber in a beaker in front of the senators. So this is not rocket science. Below, by the way, is a photograph that points out the need for rubber, because this is Washington, D.C., where they're getting out all their old hacks, horse-drawn carriages and coaches, to haul people around because they can't get rubber and gasoline for the vehicles. But here's Senator Norris showing the other senators how easy it is to make rubber out of gasoline, or out of alcohol. Now, the other thing, one of the Roosevelt administration's people argued that we really didn't need to build a plant in Omaha because there was this plant in West Virginia, which was a converted distillery. They used to make whiskey, now they're making alcohol for rubber production. He said we don't need it because the center of rubber production is moving more easterly, and here we've already got this plant. I've got dozens of newspaper clippings we've found that point out just how wrong that is. But so this is that other plant. You can look at these, by the way. These I both got off of American Memory. Okay. I'm going to try and wrap it up here with this. This is a newspaper clipping of a political cartoon that shows the reverse horn of plenty, where the United States government shoves $650 million into the big end of the horn for major oil companies, and out the other end trickles just a little bit of rubber. They were forever getting to where they met anywhere than the capacity needs of the war effort. And in fact, Senator Gillette of Iowa, as part of the article that accompanied this, said that he could hold the amount of rubber that oil companies had produced at that point in his ear. Senator Hugh Butler of Nebraska was a big player in this. Senator Carl Curtis of Nebraska was a big supporter of ethanol, both as a motor fuel and as a synthetic plastic manufacturer. Again, because they thought it would be ways to provide markets for Nebraska corn that would have a growth capacity and a price capacity attached to it. Clearly, you get into the 1950s where ethanol doesn't die, it just goes to sleep a little bit. Senator Curtis in the 50s and 60s was actively trying to get it revived, but oil prices were so low, there was no reason. The 70s come along, and the oil crisis hits, and everybody thinks that they've just invented this wonderful product called ethanol. And I think it's an area, it's one of the areas that I want to do some more looking, because in the 70s and 80s, we see some very interesting experimental stuff, and clearly now into the 21st century, wherever ethanol goes, it's a huge story. So then we get back to Dr. Christensen, and I wanted to say one last thing about him, and then I'll entertain questions. Dr. Christensen, at the end of the day, I mean, he had a chunk of farm crops processing. He owned a chunk of Agrol. He was in with Coriel. He had a chemurgy department at the University of Nebraska that Wolf's Weekly argued that one regent, Stubb Haskell, who was a Standard Oil person, shut down because Standard Oil did not want the University of Nebraska involved in competing with Standard Oil gasoline. As all of these things failed, Farm Crops Processing Corporation basically goes belly up in 1949 because slowly the oil companies were able to shut off government funds going in to support the various products they were making. It's clear to me that at the end of the day, Dr. Christensen was just absolutely heartbroken because he had the science. He could show you why this was a good idea. What he didn't have was the muscle of an oil company and the propaganda machine of an oil company. And so, here's a guy who had the right answer to the question and still lost. So that is a brief look at this work in progress, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
John, I'm confused about who taught who how to make synthetic rubber. Was it IG Farben that taught Standard Oil, or Standard Oil that taught IG Farben?
Standard Oil gave them, if I understand properly, Standard Oil gave IG Farben some of its materials, research that it had been using to develop rubber out of oil, and some other things. That whole Standard Oil IG Farben relationship is its own story, and there's plenty of stuff out there about it. It's no big secret. The Germans, they were already making artificial rubber out of alcohol, as were the Russians and the Poles. This was not a new technology. Now, I think there's a bunch of improvements that Christensen and some of these other guys made to the production process that got the volume up. They were initially supposed to produce 50,000 gallons a day. When they got up and rolling, they were producing 96,000, and so they were really expanding the rubber production from what it had been before. But there's a lot of stuff to look at there that we just haven't gotten to yet. Christensen himself was a keen inventor and had a bunch of patents that I think got assigned to the University of Nebraska, but I need to look at. There's some issues dealing with farm crops, Farm Crop Products Corporation and Agrol. They get a partnership going in 1945-46, and then there's patent issues about stuff that somehow the University Foundation has some rights to. Lots of stuff that I don't know the answer to yet.
Are we still making synthetic rubber out of ethanol?
I presume so. I don't know.
John, so in summary, what were the key factors that gave rise to the birth of ethanol production? And conversely, in the end, what were the key factors that led to its demise?
That's reasonably easy to answer. Cars got bigger, roads got better, needed better motor fuel. The Chemergy movement comes along in the mid-1920s, basically pioneered out of Iowa State University with Leo Christensen at the center. They find technologies to improve motor fuel and improve it dramatically. One of Bill Kovaric's observations, and I like it, is imagine what it would have meant to Nebraska's economy if since 1930, 10% of the motor fuel used in the United States was corn. Imagine what it meant to the United States of America if we had not had the ecological disaster of volatilizing that much tetraethyl lead into the environment. Okay, the thing that led to its demise is the big oil companies don't grow corn. Well, I thank you very much for joining us today, and keep your eyes on this station, because we'll probably have a larger, better story as the research permits. Thank you. Thank you.